views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Thank you for joining us on Farm Connections. I'm Dan Hoffman, and I'm pleased to introduce our local Marl representatives. They're here to talk about international outreach and understanding that can help local agricultural and our industries. Tonight we have with us on my right, Alex, Don, Shelley, and Joel. They took a recent trip to Cuba, and so tonight's topic is Views from Cuba. And I can't think of a better group than you four. You were there, you experienced it, and we're going to find out tonight what your perspectives were. Alex, can you tell us a little bit about where you're from, what you do, and your last name, please?
I'm Alex Perkel, and I have a corn and soybean farm between Blooming Prairie and Ellendale.
Thank you. Don?
I'm Don Buell. I'm from Tyler, Minnesota. We raise hogs. That's our main business, but we also raise some corn and soybeans.
Thank you. Shelley?
Hi, Shelley DePesto from Lewiston, Minnesota. I, with 4 partners, run a dairy farm in Lewiston, Minnesota.
Thank you.
And I'm Joel Johenningmeyer from Rochester, and I am a precision ag agronomist for Greenway Co-op.
Almost everybody with some ag background, and that's going to help us tonight as we explain what you saw in Cuba. How did you get to Cuba in the first place? I guess we'll ask Don that question.
Well, we're part of the Marl Class 5, and part of the Marl experience is to take an international trip of some sort. And Cuba was our selected destination. And so this was just part of our learning experience being a part of this Marl class. And it was really an opportunity, a unique opportunity to see a country that not very many Americans get to see.
Good point. There are some restrictions, aren't there? But before we go into that, can you tell me what Marl means?
Minnesota Ag and Rural Leadership. It's a leadership development program primarily oriented towards people who are involved in agriculture. 2/3 of the people in our class are producers of one type or another. The rest are associated with agriculture in some way, whether they be a banker, extension person, or maybe an educator. And so it was a great group of people that really wanted to learn, and very stimulating atmosphere.
Shelley, how long were you in Cuba?
We were in Cuba for 10 days. Actually, in Cuba, we were gone we spent a couple days in Miami in preparation for our trip to Cuba. We went to Little Havana in Miami and kind of experienced some of the culture, talked to Cuban folks in Miami, kind of got their take on what our experience was going to feel like once we got to Cuba. So yeah, and it was a great trip, a unique experience with the group that we had been with for just about 2 years at the time, finishing up a good 2-year stint and learning a lot about Cuba firsthand, which, like Don said, Americans just don't get that opportunity, and so it was very unique experience.
A rare event. Most people can't get in. What are some of the steps that you went through, maybe Joel, to get into the country?
Yeah, that's a good point, because you just can't buy a plane ticket and fly out of the United States and go to Cuba. You have to get permission from our government first. You have to get permission from the Cuban government secondly to get into that country. In fact, kind of the 11th hour, our permission to get into the country changed from a business visa to a tourism visa, so that kind of restructured some of our events while we were there. We still had the benefit of a lot of good, meaningful experiences, but it was just a little bit different take than what our program leaders had initially planned. So,
Alex, what similarities did you see in Cuba compared to Minnesota?
Oh, everybody's very nice. People are more self-reliant than what you might first imagine in a socialist government. They do take care of themselves very well too. They were willing to help us. I had no problem when we were on our individual tours talking with people. More of them spoke English than I had expected. They were very willing to help. I think there are a lot of similarities between them and Minnesotans.
I think one of the things that really struck me is that the people there wanted a better future for their children than what they had themselves. And I think that might be pretty universal throughout the world. But that was one thing that struck me.
So I've heard nice like Minnesotans, want to take care of each other, want their next generation to be improved upon. Anything else, Shelley? What similarities?
Similarities. Yeah, their core values I think are very, very much the same as us. Very family oriented. They don't have as many opportunities for living spaces, so many multiple generations under one household, so they're very much family oriented like we are. Not that we have family all living together, but we spend a lot of time you know, with family and stuff like that. So I think though in that way very similar to how we live.
Any holidays or special things that were different?
There's not organized religion is not recognized in Cuba, so the religious holidays I think people observe privately, but they celebrate the revolution. The 1959 revolution is very primary in the forefronts of their minds, just as we celebrate 4th of July here and our independence. The revolution is a big thing for them.
How did it change a revolution that happened in 1959? What changed?
After the revolution, trade has been restricted since then. Russia was in the country helping them out. When Russia kind of was having their own failings in their own country, they pulled out of Cuba and kind of left them high and dry, so to speak, without that influx of money and infrastructure. And so the Cuban people aren't really necessarily too excited about the Russians anymore because they had been helping them and then they just sort of left. That's a big thing for the Cubans.
As our tour guide said, though, they never really did care for the Russian government, but that was the only option that they had.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only means that they had.
During the Cold War, a government like Castro's had to choose a side. I had read that Castro had originally come to the United States thinking that they would be willing to ally, but at that time there was no way that the United States would ally with a socialist country. So that was what I had read was his second choice.
Well, from speaking with you before the show, it sounds like they're still living with some of those decisions and the consequences maybe haven't been so wonderful.
That is very true. I personally believe that it has been very well proven that socialism as a government structure does not work. Not everybody seems to have found that out yet.
I think one of the things that has changed at the time of the revolution, education became universally available to everyone, health care, and then a minimal diet. So for some people in Cuba, things improved after the 1959 revolution. And I think those are the things they have focused on. But as far as the economic structure of the country, I think socialism really has failed. And I think they're trying to find a way to transition to that, where you see individual little plots of land or farmers that were able to keep their own farms because they were of a certain size. Those are much more productive than the vast state farms. Some of those look like idle acres, what we would call idle acres. They're just not intensively farmed anymore.
The incentive is gone for those people to produce, so they just plain don't.
Right. And one of the things that was talked about when we were in the country was there are tracts of land that people could get a very long-term lease on if they would just farm it and take care of it. Kind of like our Homestead Act almost years and years ago. So I think there's some experimentation with privatization, at least in agriculture, and some of the other things like your small restaurants. But That was kind of an eye-opening experience for all of us on our tour to see how that had affected their economy.
But having access to some land, though, wasn't enough for the farmers. The reason that private agriculture is so slow to take off there is that there is also a severe limit on seeds and fertilizer. They don't have access to those things.
Right.
The capital, they just don't have the capital to produce a crop. They don't have seed to go in the ground. They don't have equipment to run the ground. They don't have, you know, harvesting equipment. And so it makes it nearly impossible for them to start in square one.
Mm-hmm. And also that to get that equipment, to get that inputs, requires them to go to a government agency and purchase them. So if you don't have the resources to purchase them, you've got to go to the government anyway. You know, so the government farms are the ones that are farming the ground.
But even the government farms don't have that exactly. Equipment was very old, and that was most of it was older than mine.
Let's say somebody takes the opportunity and grabs some of that land, that Homestead Act type land that's available, and takes it. Will they have the resources to do something with it? Will they have the seed? Will they machinery?
I think everyone here has pointed out that's one of the things that really, with the restrictions on trade, with the lack of available capital, is really a barrier. The U.S. has proposed in Congress to open trade with Cuba. And I think something like that could help to enable making life better for the Cuban people. Because then you'd get some cash flow from either tourism or some kind of trade. And then I think slowly that will work itself into the economy. So hopefully that's what will happen.
But would an influx of cheap food from the United States actually make it harder for the Cuban farmers to get established?
I guess we'd have to wait and see what economics. There's certain things that they could raise in that country that I think would be something that could be exported and generate income for that country.
And to Alex's question, what we heard over and over again, 70 to 80% of their food supply is imported into that country. Some of it is able to come from the United States since the year 2000, but much of that is from outside countries that's able to import into Cuba.
So there's hope, but possibly opening up the markets would help them get access to the tools to do the job.
Yeah, I mean, if you open up the, not just importing the food, but also importing the supplies that they need, the inputs, the fertilizer, to be able to grow their own food, it's going to take them quite a while to be able to produce that 70-80% for their population.
But as of right now, the farmers market is really making up a nice part of the fresh fruit and vegetable crop that they have. When we talked with our tour guide about the rations, I believe they were getting something like 6 pounds of rice a month, 6 pounds of beans. They were allowed 4 ounces of bread a day. And if that was what they were attempting to live on, they would be very hungry. But they have taken personal responsibility in finding other sources of food for themselves too. And I'm not sure how they do it exactly. Did Maggie ever get into how the average Cuban makes up for the shortages in that ration supply?
Part of the money that they make from their jobs, then they have to supplement their ration. It's it's kind of a unique perspective. It would almost be like a food stamp in the United States. People are and everyone in the country receives it. Every adult, every child receives their ration, and depending on how many people you have in your house is how much you go down to the ration store and you receive, if they have it in stock. Sometimes they don't have it in stock. You have to come back again tomorrow. Perhaps they've had it, but and it's very basics. It's absolutely just the basics. And for the rest of it, you have to take your own money that you've been paid during your job, equivalent of, what did we hear? Anywhere from $17 to $30 a month in equivalency is what they make in a month's time. That's their income. A portion of this has to obviously supplement their food, clothing, any other necessities, housing, everything else. So.
Shelley, you converted to dollars when you said 17.
Correct. This is what she told us in what we had estimated approximately. But typically, any person working in Cuba would receive that somewhere between $17 and $30 per month. Whether you're a physician, whether you're a plumber, whether you wait tables, whether you plow the land. That's kind of where their standards are. So it's very minimal. It's very basic, and it's like Don said. It's all about you get your food, you get your education, and you get your health care, and so you're taken care of. And anything else beyond that, you'd have to be responsible for. And to get ahead on somewhere between $17 and $30, with the other expenses you have, would take quite a unique person.
That's a special challenge. I'm sure they don't have McDonald's, but that's about two family meals at McDonald's, and that leaves a lot of days, like about 29 days in the rest of the month, to try and manage to cover all the other things.
And yeah, that is something that really struck me about the people in Cuba, is that they take personal responsibility for their own care. Even as I'd said before, they're in a socialist country. I sometimes fear that's something that people here forget, is that in the end we're responsible for ourselves. Other instances of that struck me, as far as the personal responsibility for feeding themselves beyond rations, there was the issue of if they fell down on a sidewalk, they didn't blame the government or anybody else. The government would take care of them, but it wasn't somebody else's fault. Everything bad that happened to them wasn't always the government's fault.
So if they, I'm sorry, go ahead. Don.
One of the interesting things about their ration system, if a family had a child of a certain age, they'd make sure there was dairy products in that ration. If there was a teenage girl of a certain age, make sure there was dairy in that ration. So at certain stages of life, they wanted to make sure that certain nutritional requirements were met, which I found very interesting. Just that was a total involvement of the government determining the diets.
Mm-hmm. To promote health down the line. Obviously, it's going to reduce their health care expenses across the country if people, aren't breaking their bones, as they get older and things like that. So they're really very proactive in their health care from the early on, from a nutritional standpoint.
Yeah. And even as we toured pretty much a western third of Cuba, different cities there, our meals as a group were pretty basic. I mean, we had rice, we had beans, we had some sort of meat, and we had some sort of fruit, no matter what time of day it was. So, and that's also what they ate, that's what they had in their rations. One thing that caught my attention, we were touring one of the largest state-run farm organizations in the organic area, and they were trying to produce broccoli or cauliflower. I didn't see anything in that farm, but they brought it up and said that they were trying to introduce that into their diets. But it wasn't very successful because we didn't see anything as we were traveling. Now, on the other side of it, when we went to Baradero, which is kind of the tourist area, in the hotels there, I mean, you'd see a buffet with, as many choices as we would have around here in a buffet. So it was a stark contrast to what we were seeing out in the countryside to what we were seeing in the tourist areas.
How about the roads and the infrastructure, water system, sewers?
The highway we were on was relatively good, but you could see that maintenance was an issue as far as a lot of the places where we went. We were in one particular city, and it rained, and there was water pooled everywhere. The storm drainage in those towns probably was of a standard what we would have expected 100 or 150 years ago. So it had not had the updating, and again, I think that reflects the availability of capital. But we were as tourists, we were in a nice bus, and that was better than I expected. Mm-hmm. And so to get around, it was like a lot of two-lane roads that we experience in this country. They were more narrow, and it wasn't quite what we're used to as far as Interstate 90.
Yeah, we saw some infrastructure that seemed to have probably stopped about the era of the Revolution, bridge overpasses over the highways, and the roads were built up to the bridge and no overpass. You couldn't get over the bridge. And it was shocking to us because in the United States, when they start a project, they have a budget for it, they finish it. And to see incomplete road projects all the way down the line was somewhat amazing to me. I'm like, it was shocking. So there's obviously a long way around. Transportation in Cuba there's not a lot of it. There's a lot of busing. They encourage you to carpool, hitchhike, jump on the bus, standing room only. Lots of people waiting in lines for buses. Transportation is a bit of an issue. They don't have as many city buses. And obviously not that many people have cars to get themselves around either.
There were trucks going down the highway, and people would hitchhike on the trucks. You'd see a cattle truck, and it'd be full of people. That's how they got around. Or you would see horse and buggies right along the same road that you'd see a bus or a car going on. So it was a real interesting mix of transportation modes.
Some of the most interesting moments on the bus came trying to pass a buggy being pulled by a donkey or a horse on those narrow roads.
Yeah.
I had a little different take on infrastructure in terms of roads, being to other kind of Caribbean islands. Just put that in my mind to compare, or even like Mexico. I thought their infrastructure was by far ahead of a lot of comparable islands, or how they get, how they are able to make it. I think a lot of that's due to the dollars that the Soviets were able to put into the country, and when they did that, a lot of it went to starting projects, whether it's bridges to nowhere or 6-lane interstates. You just don't see that in other comparable tourism areas. So.
Okay.
Electricity or power?
They were very conservation oriented in power. They had power pretty well in all parts of the island. We go into the hotel, and you had to put your key in the slot to turn on the lights. So, and you'd see billboards with conservation of electricity.
And the lights were all fluorescent.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they did a good job with that. Water conservation in the country, the people living in the cities in Havana would get their water turned on every other day. So, our tour guide is like, you can tell when the water's on and it's wash day for these folks because they have their laundry all hanging out, and so they've done their wash. They had water that day. They caught a lot of water on their rooftops to supplement those days when the water wasn't on. But I found that very interesting. Obviously, we take for granted the water coming up out of the ground here, not like they do there. Somebody's turning it off.
And that wasn't always the case. I mean, during the 90s was what they called a special period, and there'd be blackouts where they go for hours without electricity, and like Shelley mentioned, every other day with water, and so they fill up the cistern or let rainwater. They everywhere we went, collected the rainwater. So.
One of the things that we saw as we drove through the country, though, people were washing their front steps, very clean.
Very clean.
A couple of the people that were in our group had the opportunity to visit a private home. It was very clean. It was small, but people took good care of what they had, and so that was an impression that I got.
Okay, I'm also getting an impression from you four that you have a respect for the country and the people.
Yes.
What can we do as Midwesterners, specifically Minnesotans, to open up trade to help our people and to help their people? Any ideas?
Well, currently, Representative Colin Peterson has sponsored a bill in Congress to liberalize trade. And I think that's a good first step. I think that the mentality that we can have an embargo on that country and really starve them to death or force the government to collapse probably isn't realistic. But, I think if trade is opened up, I think it would benefit both countries, and I think it would be a good thing for the Cuban people.
Don makes a good point. Government under pressure from outside is even more resistant to change. So trade would maybe be the best way to do it. And if we as Midwesterners can do anything, it would be to talk with our representatives and let them know that we would support trade with Cuba.
Thank you, Alex. Shelley, dairy, any perspective there?
Yep, they had been doing more trade in the dairy markets up until about a year ago, and it tightened up again. So, you know, product is not flowing back into Cuba like it had been for a short period of time, and it would very much impact our country along with the Cubans. Primarily, I didn't see fresh milk in Cuba. There was no fresh milk, all powdered milk. They did a lot of yogurt there and very little cheese. So it would be an enormous benefit, I think, to the Cuban people to with some fresh calcium.
It'd be great. Let's work on that. And we've only got about a minute left. And Joel, parting comments.
I guess my take home from meeting the people is that they're a very resilient, resourceful, and proud people, and they were very open to us as people, and they understand that the issues are government to government, and anything that we can do to at least help get some of our agricultural products out of southern Minnesota to them, I think will be beneficial in the long run.
And I'm hoping that people recognize the experts about Cuban trade are at the table today. They've been there. You're all ag producers. You're familiar with industry. You're familiar with how to make things work. So I'm hoping that people email the station and ask for how to get a hold of you, because maybe we can use you as a resource to help Cuba and to help us. But thanks so much for being with us today. For more information, log on to ksmq.org, click on Farm Connections. There you can find past episodes and also participate with the blogs. You can submit your ideas, and don't forget to email the show at ksmq.org. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Tune in next time as we discuss impacts of agriculture on all of us. From everyone at Farm Connections, I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Joel. Thank you, Shelley, Don, and Alex. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your time.
Grandpa played the slang. When I was 5, I walked the fence. Grandpa held my